Welcome to a Speaking of China lecture. This is 话说中国, hosted by Rutgers Center for Chinese Studies. So please visit the center's website, rccs.rutgers.edu, for all of the upcoming events. RCCS, Rutgers Center for Chinese Studies, rccs.rutgers.edu. And you can also follow us on Facebook. The Facebook page is facebook.com/RutgersCCS. So tonight's talk is co-sponsored by Rutgers Global China Office and Rutgers Political Science Department. I'm going to hand over this talk to my colleague, Louisa Shine, who is a faculty member in the Department of Anthropology and Women's and Gender Studies at Rutgers. Louisa.
Hi, everybody. We're here in the night of the East Coast of the United States, and I have a fake background. I hope you're enjoying. I wanted to say a couple words about David Goodman, but he also said he was going to introduce himself. David, I'm wondering if you want to do that first, just to locate yourself.
Oh, hello, everybody. My name is David Goodman. I'm Professor of China Studies at Xi'anjiaotong Liverpool University in Suzhou. It's China's largest international university, joint venture university by a long way. And we've been going for about 12 years. We teach in English. I'm also, have been for the last few years, also the Vice President Academic. But it sounds like a grand title and it keeps me busy, but actually I see my real existence as being a professor of China Studies. I work on social and political change at the local level in China, and I've been working on class, as you'll hear shortly, since about 1991, where I got into it by accident. I'll tell you how that happened in a minute. But in the meantime, I'm going to hand back to Louisa, who is determined to introduce me.
Well, I'm not doing a conventional introduction. I want to tell you a little bit about one piece of David Goodman's history. Although he was trained in politics, he's actually really a quintessential China hand, multidisciplinary, just up and down, in and out, knows China, has spent, it's his life's work, and he's spent a good part of his life split between China and Australia, where he's had multiple posts and projects and grants and all sorts of things. And I was privileged in the 1990s and 2000s when economic reform and opening was beginning to create and then exacerbating huge disparities across the landscape. David broke ground with a long-term project called China's Provinces in Reform. And it was based on the key insight that China could only be understood through its internal differences, that we shouldn't be just watching those, rapidly changing places on the coast and considering that to be the place to understand China, but rather that the unevenness across the landscape was constitutive of what China was. So he really was changing the paradigm about how we took the whole place into account. And so, models like internal colonialism, extraction, uneven development, even development of underdevelopment, these kinds of things, which might not have what we called them in Chinese studies, but those were things that were less conventional frames for thinking about how China was changing. And so the provincial model of all these different places with different politics and economics was really key. And I was privileged, as I said, to be part of a recurring series of workshops that he created, in which he brought together people from all over the world, always including some people from China, with expertise in the different regions and provinces of China. And we would come together and workshop our papers. We met in cities all over the world, including, Australia, Hamburg, Germany, all over China too, including, Hainan Island and Shanxi and Macau and many other cities. And each workshop each workshop produced a volume. I encourage you to look them up under this China's Provinces and Reform series. And so I just wanted to say that having traveled all over the world to workshop with David, it's really a great pleasure to finally get him here at Rutgers. We never were able to get him physically here, although I've been trying for over 10 years because he was always on the other side of the planet or going to a conference in Mexico. It wasn't even easy to get him to the New York area. So we finally got Zoom. COVID has finally given us a chance to Zoom him in as opposed to flying him in, and I will turn it over so we can hear his lecture.
Thank you, Louisa, very much indeed for a generous introduction. I'm going to talk today, as I've been asked, about China's ruling class. But before I do that, I want to start with a little anecdote which really explains how I got drawn into this topic in the first place. So this is a photograph of one of the earliest private restaurants in Hangzhou in about 1991. It's called Wangzhu, which those of you who speak Chinese, and I say most of you do, from your names at least, many of you do, it means aristocracy. And it's an interesting private restaurant, it was, not just because it existed, but because it was built on what somebody thought a European, West European country house, minor aristocracy country house of the 17th and 18th century would look like. And it had rosewood furniture, oil paintings on the walls, silver service, all that stuff, except of course the food was all vinegar, fish and rice, because this was Hangzhou and that's all anybody eats there. Now, all that's irrelevant to this story, though it's slightly amusing. I had come out intellectually, I had come out of a context of being interested initially in comparative communism, a field of studies which doesn't really exist anymore for obvious reasons. But all my friends that I had been doing my PhD with and becoming young academics with were in fields like East German studies, Soviet Union, Poland, and so on and so forth. And in the late 1980s and early 1990s, as communism in Europe collapsed, they all said to me, well, you know, something similar is going to happen in China. And what's more, we have found from our research that the old families that used to run these countries, particularly industrialists, are the ones who are coming back into power in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. And I and other China-centered people like myself used to say, well, that's never going to happen in China because, of course, of the role of the party state and the embedded nature of the Communist Party. Whether we were right or wrong or not, we'll talk about maybe later, but that was what people used to say. Anyhow, I turn up in 1991, middle of the year in Hangzhou, to see a friend of mine who was then running the School of Economics at Zhejiang University. And he said, you know, it would be interesting for you to meet some of these private entrepreneurs. They're a new phenomenon that we have here. And of course, my brain started whirring and I thought, well, you know, people who work on Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union told me that the new private entrepreneurs are actually the families of the old private entrepreneurs, not necessarily taking their financial capital, but perhaps their social capital into a restaurant. So I turn up at this restaurant and it's opened to me, the doors are opened to me by two very old men dressed in 18th century wigs and gaiters and all kinds of costume like that, green pantaloons they were wearing, I remember. And I thought to myself, oh my God, I found them. It's the Chinese equivalent of the private entrepreneurs coming out of the woodwork in Eastern Europe. Well, of course, to cut a long story short, I couldn't have got that part of it more wrong. They were not the owners of the restaurant to start off with. They were two professors, one of French studies and one of German studies from Zhejiang University, who were moonlighting, because at that time, the salaries that professors got in the early stages of reform in China were not enough to keep body and soul together. So they got hired because they knew about things like the minor aristocracies, restaurants in the 18th and 17th and 18th century, they got hired as advisors and got hired as doormen. Now, I tell you this story for two reasons. One is to emphasize the fact that all is, particularly in China, but I suppose in most research, all is never always what it seems on the surface. And then I tell you that story for a second reason, which is, whilst I got wrong that these people were the owners of the restaurant, I didn't get wrong their class background. And as you will hear in what I'm about to tell you, the ruling class of today has a lot in common with the ruling class of before 1949. Not again in terms of financial capital, but certainly in terms of family and social capital. Those two professors, who are now retired, and one of them is in fact dead, but those two professors who I chased up much later were in fact the direct descendants of the old local elite in the area from before 1949. And indeed, in universities generally in China, I would have to say, that is more the rule than not. Where you find somebody, to tell a very sad anecdote, where you find somebody who is a genuine, from a poor background, say a peasant background, they're often known by their colleagues as the peasant, and behind their back, and looked down on in derisory terms. But again, that's a different story. Let's come on then and talk about, in more academic ways, about who the ruling class might be, who they are, and how we begin to understand them. So this is a kind of quick rule of thumb definition of what the ruling class constitutes, who they are. This is derived from work that's been carried out in the UK and Europe over a few decades. The individuals who wield power, economic power and political power, the state power that supports the economic power, the recruitment pool from which that's drawn, and of course the families that benefit from it, who in some senses are also the providers of the recruitment pool. In the Chinese context, much of the debate about whether the ruling class was changing with economic reform started with Victor Ni and his theory of market transition in 1989. His starting point was Zeleni's observations about what had happened towards the end of communist rule in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. Zeleny pointed out, or quite early on, in fact, that in a communist party state, as opposed to a more market-driven economy, redistribution is based on political principles rather than on market principles. That makes sense. He called it a redistributive economy. So what you get in an economic system, if you're working in a communist system, is under state socialism, is determined by a plan and what the politicians tell you you're likely to get. There is little market development. Starting from that point, Victor Ni said, well, okay, China's introducing a market. What's going to be the impact of the market on the redistributed economy? And he argued through a series of studies that, in fact, this would lead to a transfer of power away from the redistributors, the cadres, the redistributive economy, into the market. And he did this by looking at how villages had changed and seeing how rural stratification had changed, by seeing that cadres were getting incentives to move into the private sector, and by looking at the way state-owned enterprises, SOEs, were developing. And by 1994, he was arguing that markets had eroded commitment to the party state and were leading to a major regime change, by which presumably he did mean politically, but it's more important perhaps to look at the economic regime he's talking about. Against that, Victor Ni is no stupid sociologist. Against that, he also accepted at a very early stage that whilst this trend towards market socialism might have a profound effect on the economic and political regime, nonetheless, there is such a thing as power persistence, that politically based privileged embeds itself very easily, as it had done in former state capitalist or communist systems of Eastern Europe, that in any case there would be a high degree of path dependence depending on the regional economic specialization and the configurations of the party. I mean, after all, the party in North China was very differently organized to the party in South China as a result of the pre-49 period. And so you get a whole series of conditions here, which means that it's very hard to generalize across China as Louisa was talking about before, but nonetheless, there might be some trends. By 2002, Ni was arguing that this is not something that happens quickly. It happens through arriving at a tipping point. And in a book that he wrote with Sonia Opper in 2012, entitled Capitalism from Below, which was based largely, I have to say, on the area where I now live, East China, not just East China, but Jiangnan. He argued that the market has replaced redistributed political power. In other words, capitalism is more important than political capital. Now, of course, not everybody agrees with him about this. Other people have argued, Andy Walder, Professor Bien, John Logan, have argued that a class background and class membership is still crucial in determining economic success, and that in fact, factors of education, skills and enterprise really still play second fiddle to the political. Zeleny himself, on his own and with Costello, have argued that, no, even in China, it's the children of the elite who benefit from the opening up to market socialism of a former redistributive economy. Either them or the technocratic elite who benefit. And indeed, more recently, Zeleny has gone on to argue that this is a form of state socialism, state capitalism. There's actually a recent article that came out in June, which I recommend to you as well. And Bruce Dixon, who quite early on, through looking at the way that entrepreneurs operate, talked about the development of crony capitalism. So how do I want to come and add to this understanding, these understandings of the changes that are or are not happening to China's ruling class? So I suggest we do it in three ways. First of all, we'll have a quick look at who are the rulers and the decision makers. Then we'll have a look at the relationship between these two different groups of rulers and decision makers, between the political elite and the economic entrepreneurs. And then we'll look at the intergenerational transfer of privilege, because one thing that comes out very clearly from looking at where the generation, that is to say, how the new economic elites have been produced in the system since 1978, is that there is an intergenerational transfer of privilege. What's really surprising, though, and this goes back to my anecdote about the aristocratic restaurant in Hangzhou in 1991, is that social capital from before 1949 is probably even more important than the political capital that comes to people who had served in the party state as managers before the economic reform era, or their children. So that's where we're going with all this. So let's have a look first then. So let's start off with the easy bits, the political elite, the cadres. A lot of them, largely the numbers have increased slightly over the years, but not greatly. There's about 43 million cadres in total. What's really interesting, though, about cadres, even immediately after 1949, as well as with the introduction of reform, is that not all of them are members of the Chinese, or have been members of the Chinese Communist Party. In the 50s and 60s, this was because the people who had been managers, who had been not part of the communist movement before 1949, had been economic managers. Their expertise was needed in order to run the new system. How do you build, a revolutionary regime which has been fighting in North and East China for the previous decades doesn't have a lot of engineers. If it does, they're engineers who make bombs, not engineers who make roads and railways. So you need to bring all those kinds of people into the ambit of the party state. So from a very early stage, there were cadres at low level, cadres at senior level, who were not members of the party. Of course, they had to acknowledge the leadership of the party, but they weren't necessarily subject to party discipline. They were also, to some extent, protected. It's really interesting. I don't want to go into this in too much detail, but if you look at Andy Walder's study of what happened to these two groups of political elites from before the Cultural Revolution, during the Cultural Revolution, it's the ones who had been part of the revolution who were heavily criticized and ran into problems. The ones who were brought in as specialists and for their expertise managed to survive, not totally, but they managed to survive in higher percentages in a better way through the Cultural Revolution and, of course, subsequently afterwards. You have a figure there on my slide that 38% of local cadres are not members of the CCP. That, of course, is now, but even before the Cultural Revolution, there was a significant number like that. One of the things about the new political elite since 1978, since the reform era started, is that there have been, and we'll see this again in the way that the economic elite has been generated, but there have been significant changes in the composition of the kinds of people or the backgrounds of people. The most important is clearly the emphasis on education. Before the Cultural Revolution and during the Cultural Revolution, whether you had a degree or not did not matter. People, what mattered was that if you were a leading Chinese member of the Chinese Communist Party and had a position in the party, what mattered was your standing in the history of the revolution, in the course of the experience of the revolution. Education was there, but largely for the people who had not been, with one or two exceptions, but largely for people who were the specialists who had been brought in after 1950. With the changes wrought by the introduction of reform at the end of 1978, all that's changed. And there has been a much greater emphasis on educational levels, which is why I call this the passage of the revolutionary generation. The revolutionary generation are sometimes said to have been replaced by technocrats, and under one or two leaders like Hu Jintao, there was talk about the engineers from Tsinghua conquering the system and all that kind of stuff. Certainly it's the case that having a degree is crucial. As you can see, you need a degree to hold a serious position in the party. And a large percentage of senior leaders now have PhDs. Some, of course, like our great leader, have two, but that's not necessary even for academics these days, or at least not yet. So maybe that's over-egging it a bit. And as Walder, again, in one of his studies found out, if you have education, you're 26, and you're a party member, you're 26 times more likely to be a cadre than somebody who only went and graduated from high school. That's a phenomenal change in the passage of the revolutionary generation. Let's move on then quickly to have a look at the economic elites. Those of you who are well attuned with China will know that this is a picture of a Bentley, but the Bentley costs less than the number plate, which is quite interesting when you come on to talk about economic elites. There certainly are wealthy people in China. The latest figures I have for billionaires is 373, and there's about $1.6 millionaires. These numbers of billionaires and millionaires are US dollar millionaires and billionaires, not Chinese dollars. What's an entrepreneur? If you look at the data that the National Bureau of Statistics in China puts out, it's about 11% of the population. Well, of course, that's bullshit. Sorry, that's a technical term which means nonsense. That's not true. It's true in one sense, in the sense that entrepreneurs are self-employed business people. But the overwhelming majority of the 11% are just that, self-employed business people, which includes the man or woman who makes pancakes at the end of your street, the barber who comes around with a bell and offers to cut your hair, or the person who sells bingo in winter in Beijing. Not everybody who's an entrepreneur is a Jack Ma or the owner of JD or any of those things. There's a big difference between the big entrepreneurs or the large-scale entrepreneurs and the people who are regarded as entrepreneurs by the statistical system. Secondly, as you'll see in a minute, very little of the wealth that is created and managed by successful entrepreneurs in large scale is private wealth. As Barry Norton has been writing for the last 10 years, and with a great deal of conviction, I believe, convincingly, I believe, most of the economic enterprises in China are hybrid. They are often structurally hybrid. That's to say, local government owns a percentage of the, or even senior national government sometimes, owns a percentage of the equity. But even when government or the party state doesn't own any equity, they actually have a controlling interest by virtue of the ways that the decisions are taken in a locality. And that really leads on to my final point to make to you briefly about entrepreneurs, which is that if you come to look at China as a reforming political economy, you often think, or I do anyhow, or did at the beginning anyhow, I thought, well, this is a form of capitalism. And therefore, what I should be looking for is capitalists. And if I'm looking to find the elite, part of the elite will be an economic elite called capitalists. Well, of course, there are one or two people, a few people at the top of the economic tree in China who might fill that category. But this is not a capitalist system. What do I mean by that? I mean, it's not a system which is run by or for or in the interests of the capitalists. It may be that there are some capitalists who are part of the party state who manage in some ways to either manage or own or effectively own some of the resources. And so therefore you might call them state capitalists, but they're not all. It's not a capitalist system. It's a state, a market socialist system. I had a long row with Li Chunling, who's professor of sociology at Cass, years ago now. Because when I started out trying to analyze these things, I wanted to call all serious capitalists in China. And I wanted to make them part of the economic elite. And she said, no, you can't do that. You can't do that. They're middle class, because at the end of the day, most of them are totally subservient to their local party committee. They do not make an influence in their own regard. And she kind of, I think she's convinced me of that. The numbers certainly back up what she says. So looking at entrepreneurs, we should regard them as part of the middle class. They are there by virtue of their expertise, skill, and knowledge, not really by virtue of their economic capital. Here's some more normal entrepreneurs. How did enterprises develop under the reform era? Well, there's a kind of, I won't go through this in too much detail. I imagine many of you know already, but there's a kind of historical bent to this, which is actually quite important. Starting in the early 1980s, non-state enterprises or non-elements of market socialist enterprises started, first of all, in the countryside with town and village enterprises, collective in some sense, private in others. All kinds of things would be going on. Local government, a village would get itself together and decide to start a factory, or an entrepreneur, an individual would come back with some expertise and say, look, I'm going to build a wire factory here. Will the village support me? and so on and so forth. And you get, particularly around the periphery of the largest cities, you've got a whole series of town and village enterprises growing up. At the same time, after about 1984, increasingly you got individual household businesses starting in towns of the kind, some of those that I was talking about before, you know, the people who sell various things on the street, but also the private restaurants of the kinds that I started off my talk with. But there's always a mix amongst these different kinds of things. If you're the owner of a private enterprise, how do you grow? Let me tell you an anecdote. I had a friend, again, I told you I was in Hangzhou starting this whole process of research in the early 1990s. I made friends with a guy who had been working as a grease monkey in a factory. His mother was a Catholic. He'd read a lot of books when he was a child, but because of the Cultural Revolution, he hadn't got to go to university. The party state was banging on in the 1980s about go out and become private entrepreneurs and all this kind of stuff. So he decided he would raise bees and make honey and sell it to shops and hotels in the Hangzhou area. And he did that. He did it for about 3 years. He made himself a bit of money. And his mother was getting on at him about the time he got married and had children, one or two other things. So he thought he ought to do something else. So he built himself one of these private restaurants. It was called the Thai Princess's Palace. It was in Hubin in Hangzhou. And it had a very fancy, very ornate plastic and glass front that was supposed to look like the minaret where a Thai princess might hide herself away. Of course, the food inside was not Thai food. It was vinegar, fish, and rice, because this was Hangzhou, as I said before. But that's the story. Anyhow, he did that for a few years, and he got married, and there was a child on the way. And he thought, well, I can't do this for the rest of my life. Running a restaurant's too hard. So he wanted to move into something else. And a cousin of his had been to Hong Kong and brought a book back, which he gave to this friend of mine, and the friend was reading it. It was a book by Graham Greene, and it talked about a food mixer. And the guy I knew thought to himself, bloody hell, what's a food mixer? If I don't know what a food mixer is, and that means they don't exist in China. The time I started to manufacture them, well, more or less. So he talked to somebody about getting plans for he made a deal with a German company. He worked out how to do it and got stuck. No land, no labor force. The bank refused him capital. After a few months, somebody tapped him on the shoulder and said, you're going about this entirely the wrong way. You go to local government and you say, please help me. I will give you half my equity, and in return, you will make sure I get land, labor, and a bank loan. Of course, it works. And he's quite wealthy now. Actually had a second child even before the policy changed, which is a good mark of how wealthy he had been. So it's a good, it's one of those stories. It's not an untypical story, but it points to the fact that private enterprise is not necessarily private enterprise. And this happened on a grand scale. It also happened, by the way, the other way around, with state-owned enterprises divesting themselves of their assets. I spent a lot of time in my life in North China, in Taiyuan. Taiyuan has the oldest iron and steel works in the whole of China, started by a warlord in 1921. It was a filthy place. It was a huge enterprise with almost 200,000 people working in it. It produced some very high quality stainless steel, which is still used, actually, not stainless steel, high quality steels used in things like space projects and stuff like that. And it still does that. But it did all kinds of things. And of course, in the way of state enterprises at the time, it did everything for itself. It was a danwei, a self-enclosed unit in itself. It had schools, it had restaurants, it had workshops for the lorries, it had lorry fleets that worked for it and took its goods around. It had everything. In the era of economic reform, the managers were under orders to and decided to sell off all of these assets. How do you sell them off? You go to the manager of the lorry pool and you say, right, all that's in your lorry pool, your wagons and so on, are all yours. In return, we only want two things. And you get all the people as well. In return, we only want two things. You have a contract with us to do the deliveries as you have been doing, and we own half your equity. Well, that happened across the board with everything. I mean, the largest glass manufacturer for a while in China, glass jar, jam jar manufacturer in China for a while, was the Taiyuan Iron and Steel, one of the Taiyuan Iron and Steel company's spin-offs. Because this is what they did. They used to have a workshop that made glass products because they needed to make glass products in order to make whatever you do with iron and steel, I don't know, but that's how it goes. And that happened across the board with many, many large-scale state-owned enterprises. Of course, at the end of the day, you have a situation where a company which used to have 200,000 possibly only has 20,000. But the enterprises still go on, as you can see from the numbers there. Some of them became, some of these the new companies that were set up, some became public sector enterprises, some became corporate, some became private or quasi-private with hybrid structures, and some even became joint ventures with foreign companies. So you have a huge mixture of different kinds of entrepreneurs going on. And you can see this change from the 80s into the current era, or the more recent era, from a few figures quite easily. The initial wave of entrepreneurs, people who were entrepreneurs, managers, and the kinds of people we're talking about, the economic elites, initially were peasants or workers, but by the middle of the 1990s, very few of them were. Most of them were originally largely uneducated. Much later on, they were much better education. And on top of everything else, many of the economic elites had, in fact, starting in the middle of the 1990s, come out of the party state. Many of them were party cadres, former party cadres. Many of them were people who had been working in the state sector. The state sector, you can understand because, of course, state sector enterprises divesting themselves of different parts is bound to inherit, they're bound to inherit people who had been previously managers in the state sector. But remarkably, the cadre force is quite significant. Bruce Dixon, in one of his studies of East China, found that 53% of contemporary economic elites at local level had previously were already party members and had been party cadres. So it's quite phenomenal. So you have kind of two things going on here. One is that the entrepreneurs, the economic elite, emerges from the party state. The other thing that you have that's going on quite dramatically is that the entrepreneurs themselves are becoming politicized, or they are politicized. Of course, as I've just said, in many cases, people were party members before they became entrepreneurs. But even those who were not were often encouraged to become party members. I recall very clearly in central Shanxi one day, meeting a guy. I've interviewed about 9,500 members of the economic elite since 1991. So there's a few interviews I don't remember, but there are some I remember quite well. One of them was in central Shanxi, a coal mine owner who was presented to us as the local party secretary, which he undoubtedly was. But that was given in a way, it was implicit that was the reason he was an entrepreneur. Whereas in fact, as you'll hear in a second, it was the other way around. The interviews always follow a set pattern, more or less. 2 hours followed by a meal. So if it's in the morning, you go for lunch with them. It's the evening, you go for dinner. And very often what happens is you give them your protocol of questions and they answer them. You have some discussion, free flowing. But very often what happens is that over dinner or over lunch, you get a slightly different story. And in this case, the case of the coal mine, it was very different. So he tells me he's presented to me as the party secretary, blah, 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 blah. Okay. Later on, it transpires, and he told me an honest story, which was he had been a coal mine, he'd run a fleet of coal mine delivery trucks and then decided he wanted to own a coal mine. Well, okay, fair enough. What else do you do if you're a go-getting young man in Shenxi? There is, at that time, there probably wasn't much else to do. So he decided to do that. But in fact, he had never been a party member. He had been forced to become a party member and encouraged to become the party secretary in order to be allowed to buy the coal mine. And he told us that over lunch, which, by the way, he cooked himself over a little stove. It was very nice food too. No matter. Entrepreneurs are also, in addition to being encouraged to become party members, they're encouraged to join chambers of commerce, to join the Jiangxie, become delegates to the People's Congress, all that kind of thing. And in return, of course, they get access, as I said before, access to factors of production. Here's some figures on party membership of entrepreneurs from a study I undertook, which I'll talk about perhaps a bit in greater detail in a minute, a study of 469 very, very rich entrepreneur economic elites in 5 different cities in China. More than half of them were party members, and most of them held some kind of political position. But interestingly, a higher proportion of them had parents, at least one parent, who'd been a member of the Chinese Communist Party. And one of the phenomena that I found in interviewing particularly rural entrepreneurs over the years is often the children don't join the party. And their attitude, which some of them have even expressed to me, is, why should I join the party? My father owns the village, or my father runs the village, right? So, there's nothing really surprising here, nor there either, really. In case you hadn't gathered, I'm really a photographer. I just discovered at a very early age that being a photographer paid less than being an academic. So I use the photographs I take to amuse people as we go through a talk like this. Here's a quote from a friend of mine, Zhou Xiaohong, who used to be my boss at Nanjing University when I taught there. Rich people are not independent of the party state. And that, I think, he says it much more elegantly than that, but because he has to. But that, I think, is the way things are. This guy used to be the Dean of College of Sociology at Nanjing University. He's now, because he's got to a certain age, he's now still on the staff as a professor, but he's no longer the dean. He's one of the best political sociologists in China, I think, along with Sun Yiping. So let's move on then to the intergenerational transfer of privilege, because that remark about my father running the village is really quite telling. And of course, bears out much of what Zeleny used to say, or has said, about changes in Eastern Europe, that it's the technocratic elite and the children of the Cadres who are the beneficiaries of change, not a new emerging class. So let's first of all start off with the myths of modernization, or rather the single most important myth of modernization, which is that education leads to social mobility. Well, it doesn't. Gregory Clark, who's University of California, Santa Cruz, has written a book with the unfortunate title, The Sun Also Rises, S-O-N, as opposed to S-U-N. He's written a series of books, all with Hemingway titles emasculated in that way. Well, this is the one about intergenerational transfer of privilege, where he shows that even in most economically developed societies, the intergenerational transfer of privilege still runs at about 74%, which means, of course, that 26% doesn't. But don't run away with thinking that means that 26% of people are upwardly mobile. They're not. 13% are upwardly mobile and 13% are downwardly mobile. So you have to watch the statistics very carefully. In China, my estimate from my own research is that the intergenerational transfer of privilege is about 84%, which is significantly higher than it is, say, in America, which is 74%, or the UK. Other research clearly bears this out. Research from Peking University, from various other universities around the world, shows that a child's socioeconomic position is determined by their parents' level of income, level of education, occupation, and membership of the party. A daughter is near certain to follow her father's occupation and status, and boys are about 74% the same. And of course, we can, if we look around us, we can tell. As I was saying before about party pre-49 local elite influence on who runs universities or who teaches in universities today in China. No surprise at all, and no surprise that people who have status in today's China have their children go on to benefit from that. Huge number of state-owned enterprises, their executives, a huge number of them have families overseas. 90% of millionaires are the children of senior officials. That's a report in 2006 from the party's own organizational department. I undertook a study of local cadres in Shanxi, which was published in 2000, which showed that there was a very clear 3-generational pattern. Somebody who started out as a local cadre in the 1950s as a peasant, from a peasant background, whatever the causes of being a peasant at that time, they themselves became a cadre, but their children would become business people. A later study undertaken in Mianyang in Sichuan, Jiaochang in Shanxi, and Zhongshan in Hainan, showed that women entrepreneurs, to succeed, needed a father, or usually a father, but certainly a parent, who was had some influence in the party state. And there have been a number of studies which showed that cadres' children have salaries that start higher on average than people who don't have cadre children. All that's very, very interesting. But what's even more interesting is this study I undertook in between 2009 and 2012 in 5 cities in China, in Qingdao, in Taiyuan, in Lanzhou, in Zhongshan, and in Nanjing. We tried to interview 100 people in each place, just missed it, got 469 altogether. Remarkably, more than 80%, more than 4/5 have one member, one grandparent at least, who was a member of the pre-49 local elite, landowning local elite. 62%, 63% had family members who were both local elite and Chinese Communist Party members from before 1949. And almost a quarter had at least one member in that generation who was both at that time a member of the local elite and a communist simultaneously. Not really surprising, any of this. If you think about what happened immediately before and immediately after 49, there are a number of factors that explain it. Many people who joined the Communist Party in the 30s decided they were from landed gentry, landed elite backgrounds. They decided give their land away, go off and become communists. And so they were like that. Of course they were. Though. More than a quarter of the 7th Central Committee were from that kind of background. That's the 1945 Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party. Why not? Where else are revolutionaries going to come from? There's a very interesting article by Minglu Chen in Chinese Journal of Contemporary China, 2012, on becoming elite, which explains this kind of process starting in the mid-1930s up to 2010 about a particular family, an ethnography of a particular family in North China. Very interesting. If you, in 1947 to 49, if you were a rich landlord, you would say to one son, join the Communist Party. To the other son, you'd say, join the Kuomintang. Wouldn't you? It's a coping strategy. The same landlord after the communist, or same kind of landlord after 49, when the communists moved into, communist armies moved in, might try to get their daughter married off, their beautiful daughter married off to an incoming soldier, simply in order to preserve the family and its wealth if possible. These are stories which are normal. There's nothing abnormal about this. And it explains these kinds of figures. When I first started doing these complex life histories, family histories in this way, it was very interesting. I would go around talking about, I remember doing it in London on one occasion when the English China studies experts all said to me, oh, this can't possibly be the case. There's been a revolution in China. So, okay, I took it, it's a criticism. But the Chinese people in the audience came up to me afterwards and said, oh, I'm so glad you're saying these things. This is the story of my family. And indeed, that has subsequently become very apparent to me. I'm going to just finish, almost finish, by referring back to my university. One of my, I said I'm vice president academic of a large university in China. We have lots of Chinese as well as foreigners on the staff. And, you know, we're a Chinese university. We're under the provincial government. And my party trick is being able to tell people their class background. It's not difficult, but the party trick is being able both to know generally what class they're from, but if you know what part of China they're from, you can even tell them where grandfather worked in 1947, and that sometimes slays people. But it's a good game. I've been teaching in universities for 50 years, actually. And I suppose that's one of the benefits of doing that. You have some experience of these things. So let's finish off then with, oh, sorry, I missed the best bit. My good God. These are some of the comments about social capital that the people we interviewed in between 2009 and 2012 came up with. So it's not just that they have social capital easily quantified going back to before 49. What they think about themselves, what they think, how they articulate to themselves their role in China really reinforces it. You can read these as you like, but my favorite one is the last one. We are from the privileged classes. It's hard to define ourselves now that things have changed, but we are still part of the upper class. We have never left. And I think a lot of people think that. We had a guy who came to work with us at the university a few years ago. He said, I'm so glad, Chinese guy originally, moved to another country and then came back to work with us. He said, I'm so glad to be coming back to work with you. He said, my family used to own the main street in Suzhou. These are stories that people tell themselves. In one sense, it doesn't matter whether they're true or not. It doesn't matter whether they're historically accurate. What matters is that people think them, because it then drives their social capital. And I think that's really, that's an interesting observation too. So this is a merchant's house in Shanxi, the old ruling class, just as a reminder. To sum up, this is what the emergent ruling class, how I think it should be characterized. Cadres are still dominant. Entrepreneurs exist, but they're secondary. There are, I haven't said much about this, but there are limitations on the growth of an urban middle class. If you extrapolate from what I was saying about changes in the political economy of the reform era, you will understand that I might want to say that the middle class is actually being driven more by changes in the party state rather than any separate economy, independent economy. And I think that would still be my position. In other words, China's middle class is really the poorer part of the upper class rather than an independent middle class. I'll investigate that a bit more, of course. I want to stress the importance of long-term social capital, obviously. And really who we're dealing with here as the ruling class are cadres, technocrats, and the children who've benefited from the intergenerational transfer of privilege. And as somebody who works in a university that is geared to the intergenerational transfer of privilege, I might actually, I don't want to say I know what I'm talking about, but I do experience it firsthand quite often. Just to finish then, there we are. Can't be more long-term social capital than Xi'an and the tomb of the first emperor. And this that I've been talking about is from a chapter that I've provided in fact, the last chapter of volume 2 of a 2-volume work that the 6 of us are currently producing, our writing collective, on class and the Chinese Communist Party. Next year is 100 years anniversary of the founding of the Chinese Communist Party, and we're looking at 100 years of social change. It will be published by Routledge. Go out and order your 2-volume copy now. But there we go. I'm happy to answer any questions. I'm sorry if I talked for a bit long, but I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, David. That was really fascinating, amazing numbers and depth. So we are going to open to questions, and I think we're sort of offering all 3 options. That means you could type something into chat and I will relay it to David. You could raise your hand using the hand raising function in the participants list, which is a line just below the participants if you've opened that list. Or if you're on video, you can signal, raise your hand physically, and David can call on you himself. Would anyone like to start? Would anyone like to ask a question right away? Comments welcome as well. Okay. Let's see now, David, can you see the hands? Do you want to call on them yourself?
I can see a question. Joyce Fan has sent me a question.
Okay. Yes.
Joyce says, I'm curious if this pattern is more common in North China than in Southern China, where a market economy was more dominant. Well, I think it's true that the degree of hybridity for state-owned enterprises is higher in North China because, of course, the industrial North and Northeast had more state-owned enterprises. But local government has been very active in South China. So I live in Jiangsu province, as I'm sure Joyce knows. In Jiangsu province, there were not a huge number by proportion of state-owned enterprises, but at an early stage of the reform era, local government took a leading role in being involved, and is still. The part of Suzhou where our university is a monument to local government's involvement in local industry. Just to give you an example, it's a trivial example, but it shows you how it works. Our university, which is a large university, has quite a large campus, but we don't have any dorms. The Suzhou Industrial Park, which is where the university is, and another 17 universities, acts as a property company, a real estate company. It builds, through other companies, it builds the dorms and it runs them and it makes money from them, just as it builds the blocks of flats that people flock to live in. So it's true that the North is more industrial. It's not true that government is less involved in the South. Zhejiang is slightly different. Zhejiang always was, if you look at the figures for Zhejiang starting in the late 1980s, private enterprise in Zhejiang was always more private than hybrid. So there's elements of that. But in the last 5 years, as you probably know, there's been a bit of a political economic rollback on those kinds of things. So it's a work in progress. And I agree with Joyce that we should be very wary of regarding every place as developing at the same speed and in the same way. No question about that. And I surely didn't mean to imply that with my overgeneralizations.
We have a hand from Shu Hu.
Okay.
And it would be great if people want to open their videos now so that there's a little bit more facial interaction. It's always strange.
Could I know who people are?
Yeah, it'd be wonderful if you can also identify yourself.
Yeah, say where you are, if you're at a university or whatever. It would be nice to know.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Louisa. Hi, Professor Goodman. I am Shu Hu, a sociologist based in Singapore. Thank you for the fascinating talk. My question is, I'm quite intrigued because you mentioned in the talk that CCP was organized differently in Northern China and Southern China, even from before 1949. And you also shared that you were able to tell your colleagues' family background, what their grandparents might be doing in 1947. That's quite specific at parties, gatherings with your colleagues. So I'm really curious about these regional differences and how those, the past privileges got maintained and reproduced over so many decades in contemporary China. So I would love to hear you to elaborate on those. Thank you.
No, it's a great question. And excuse me if I sounded too immodest, too boastful. The party trick works the following way. I try to guess, and if I guess right, then I try and push and push. Now, because of my own particular interests in party history, I've done a lot of work on local base areas, North and South, and various other things. And so, given that the elite is actually a small group of people in proportionate terms, it's not difficult if you're dealing, if somebody tells you they're from a particular county in North China that you happen to know the revolutionary history of, and they look and sound like they're from the old ruling class, bingo, you get them very easily. So there's a lot of guesswork involved, but it's not that difficult. Today, is where you are, is Mid-Autumn Festival, National Day for the PRC. You probably don't know that it's also United Nations International Day of the Senior Citizen. And I'm not making it up, but the reason I'm mentioning it is that if you spend enough time in universities and do research in different areas, these kind of things just accrete. So that's how it goes. Now, how does it actually happen? I mean, you're much more interested in, not in my explanation of my skills, but in what actually happened, right? And that's entirely the case. So the communist movement, as it started out, did different things differently in different places. I mean, the most extreme cases would have to be Yan'an and Hainan. Now, Hainan had a base area from 1927 all the way through to the end of the Japanese War. It was, when I say a base area, I mean a communist base area. It was actually led by Chinese Communist Party Cadres, sent out of Guangzhou after the failure of the 27 revolution. They had nothing to do with Mao Zedong, nothing. They barely knew, the two groups barely knew that the other existed, even when Mao was in North China. So bad was that situation that when the PRC was founded, there was constant conflict between those two groups, or not between the two groups, but the local leaders in Fangbaiju, the local leaders in Hainan, found that they couldn't talk to Beijing. And of course, it led to their execution. They ran into real problems. But they had dealt differently with their local circumstances. They had land reform starting in 46. they I mean, they weren't out of complete contact with either the Comintern or Yan'an, but they were not controllable in the same way as Yan'an was, or even the base areas of on the borders of Shanxi. So these things did work very differently. These were people who were all in Hainan. They were all largely local landowners who started it. In North China, it was very different. In Shanxi, for example, people like Boibo were, a large number of people were attracted first by nationalism and only secondly by communism. So, I mean, the number of factors that are involved in the different kinds of operation depends on a range of indicators, one of which was who was there, how many soldiers there, which communists were there, how many soldiers they had with them, what the local political economy was like. Let me give you an example that will shock you if you don't know this already. In 1938, the Communist Party won elections in Wuxian County to form the government under Yan Xishan, the national government, National Resist Japan government under Yan Xishan. But they won the elections in Wuxian County. How did that happen? It happened because they had organizers from that county who'd gone off to the south in the 1920s, knew how to learn the skills about organization and had brought the skills back. And from the early 1930s onwards, had worked with people to develop a communist movement. It was a movement called communist. It adhered to many communist principles. It didn't necessarily adhere to all the principles or operate in all the ways that Yan'an did. In fact, it clearly didn't. Land reform was done differently and somewhat early, actually, without permission. The best thing I can say to you is if you're really interested in the variety of communist experiences that goes back that far, there's a book by Feng Chung-yi and David Goodman called North China at War. And it has in it a contrasting chapter by Greg Benton on the South China base areas. Now, what that then bequeaths to the post-49 period are people, cadres with mentalities, people with interests in doing things differently, people with local knowledge of doing things differently. So when it comes to saying, you know, you're a cadre in your home, in an area in 1949, all of a sudden at the end of the war, you know that if you're a local, you know local people, people who are not party members, you know who to bring in, you know how to operate. Why was it that in the late 80s and early 1990s, why was it that Zhejiang, the individual economy, could be so successful as opposed to the hybrid local government related economy that I was talking about in Jiangsu? You know, Jiangnan includes parts of both Jiangsu and Zhejiang, as you know. Jiaxing is on the border. Jiaxing had its private enterprise just across the border, south of Suzhou, had its local government enterprise. Now, how does that happen? It happens because people run the system, people who've come out of different political, economic environments, and they operate differently. That's all. There's nothing sacred in a provincial border, or even for that matter, a county border. It's where people, or county borders perhaps, because people tend to move in county areas historically, but provincial borders, no. But it's just that they created mentalities and they did things these ways. It's complex, but it's very interesting. What you said, you're a sociologist, not an anthropologist.
Yeah, I'm a sociologist.
What do you work on?
I work on family and education in China. I'm more a quantitative sociologist, so I work with survey data. Thank you.
David, you do have another question. Did you see whether you analyzed the backgrounds of the 25 men in the political bureau of CCP? This is from
It's not 25 men, it's 25%. It's 25%. Have I done it or have other people done
it? The question is, did you analyze?
No, this was from 1945. It's well known, 25% of the, oh, you're talking about now or the 7th Central Committee?
Xiangang, can you clarify? Current.
I think I mentioned the political bureau.
So Xiangang says current.
No,
the 25 men in the current.
Have I? No, I haven't.
Have you analyzed the background?
No, I haven't.
So I see another question from my student, Lissa Crane, who is working on philanthropy in China.
Yeah, that's a good, of course, I see the question too. Philanthropy in the, as a role in intergenerational reproduction class. That's fascinating because, of course, as you know, from the work of Ping Ti Ho and others, in pre-revolutionary China, philanthropy was a big thing. I mean, how did you ensure that you didn't have mad children? You adopted somebody, and that happened a lot. I don't get it now. I've never focused on philanthropy, or by philanthropy, you mean complete altruism, don't you? You mean going and finding younger people or not young people, people who are from poorer backgrounds.
Not necessarily, just, I guess, any practices that people would identify as being.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so the only thing I can contribute to that question, which I agree is an interesting one, particularly in historical context, the only item I can help you with is, I remember that during the Cultural Revolution, many families who had more children than they should have, in the sense of if they had more than 1 or 2 children, then the children had to be sent out down to the countryside, would then ensure that those children were adopted by other members of the family in order to stay in towns. That's the only example of that I come across. And that does show up in my survey data as well.
I think one of the things I've learned from Lissa is that there's a certain fascination among present-day philanthropists with the idea of the philanthropic family, the big name, the Rockefeller, whatever. And I'm wondering if you see any of that in the, in intergenerational transfer of privilege narrative. We've always been so magnanimous. We've always given to the community, whatever it is. Is there anything like that?
Look, I have to say, in that survey of 469 people, or the results were 469. The image of the elite of themselves that comes out is not like that, not very altruistic at all. If you ask, if you are in anywhere else in the world, if you ask people, what class are you? Very few people say they're upper class. Upper class people, in the UK, for example, you say, what class are you? People go, oh, I'm upper middle class. When they mean they're upper class, right? They're part of the ruling class. They say they're upper class. In this survey, we had, I think, just under 10% saying, oh, we're the elite. And I thought, wow, that's really very, very interesting. I don't know how far you can take it, but it is quite interesting.
How are they saying that we are the elite? Are they euphemizing it, or what's that?
Often they say we're the elite. They just say, do you?
Wow.
There have been surveys undertaken since 1996 across China by a combination of Xian Jiaotong, what's his name? Yenja Bien, and CAS. And they ask people to self-identify your class. And then they also ask in another survey, and which of these classes do you fit into? It's fascinating, the contrast between the two, because most people say, when given the classes and asked to fit themselves, most people say we're working class. But if asked to identify without being given the class beforehand, most people say they're middle class. And it's been like that. It's been like that for 25 years. The numbers slightly change, but nothing very major. Most people think of themselves as middle class, but will identify themselves explicitly as workers, working class, subordinate class.
So you have someone from India who teaches comparative politics.
I saw that.
Would you like to field that question?
Where was it?
Professor Goodman, a fascinating talk. Any analysis on overseas Chinese communities / elites' role in China's social, economic, and political landscape in the current Xi era?
Yeah, of course.
And this is somebody at University of Hyderabad.
Yes, well, nice to speak to you. I live in Suzhou. If you know China well, you'll know that there's a renegade part of Suzhou called Kunshan on the borders with Shanghai. It's renegade because it's no longer administratively under Suzhou city. This is an unfortunate historic pattern. Shanghai until 1910 was actually part of Suzhou, as you probably know. It's known as Little Suzhou. But obviously economic development means that things go off and do their own thing. Kunshan, which is there, is really a Taiwanese town. I mean, there would be 1.5 million Taiwanese living in Kunshan, and most of the factories and most of the enterprises there, large-scale enterprises, are originally sourced from Taiwan. All kinds of things. And in a sense, that's not really too surprising. If you go to Taicang, which is next to Kunshan, and is still part of Suzhou, there's about 400 German enterprises there. This is, as I'm sure you know, there's a theory about migrant change, that people go where they can speak to people in the same language, get the same food, and not have to worry about other people not being people like us. So this is quite normal. Kunshan is a classic example, but much of the development of Fujian and Guangdong, particularly in the 80s and 90s, was driven by overseas Chinese coming back and bringing ideas and money and enterprises to work in the growing Chinese economy. I worked for a while, years ago, for a bank in Hong Kong that was interested to assist the development of venture capital in China. And we were allowed to do that. It was an interesting operation because although we had been set up to support the development of venture capital within China, what we ended up doing was supporting Huaqiao, overseas Chinese in East and Southeast Asia who wanted to go to Guangdong and Fujian, and to a certain extent Guangxi, to set up enterprises there. So the venture capital went to the foreigners, not to the Chinese, or the foreign citizens anyhow, not to the Chinese in PRC. So yes, there is lots of overseas Chinese involvement in these things, but you know, people used to talk about the globalized economy in the 1990s. It really, globalization has limits, and one of the limits of globalization has been, it's not a limit, it's a strength as well, but one of the limits has been that globalization is actually involvement with China. I remember, you know, I've been on various Australian government bodies, and I remember once in the 1990s going to a reception in the embassy where the ambassador, Australian ambassador, very proudly said, China is the #1 trading partner of Australia. Well, forgive me, even then, there were only 2 countries in the world that really didn't have China as the #1 trading partner. What are they? Mexico and Canada. And can you guess why? Because there's a bloody great country, bloody great economy in between them that dominates both Canada and Mexico. Elsewise, everybody trades with China, even Germany and the UK. So globalization is about China, which is why, by the way, decoupling, as the American president currently talks about it, is bonkers. It would lead to a disaster for the American economy. Joyce, you have another question, I see.
Yes, and this will probably be the last one unless somebody wants to put their hand up and hold a place before we have to end. So go ahead, David.
Joyce, please, what was your question? I didn't see it. I couldn't read it, I'm sorry.
Yeah, okay, so I was just curious.
Where are you, Joyce? You asked a question. Where are you? What do you do?
Oh, I'm a student at NYU Law from Beijing. And I'm mostly here just to figure out what to write for my law review notes. And this is very fascinating.
So where are you now?
I'm in Jersey City.
Oh.
And sorry, I didn't realize that you live in Suzhou. I presume you lived your data from northern China and downloaded your background, like all of us.
No. I've been here for the last 8 years, teaching and then running the university. And before that, I was for 4 years at Nanda, overlapping with a period at the University of Sydney. And before that, various other places, but yeah.
And
I used to consider myself North Chinese if I had anywhere, but recently the Suzhou government have decided that I'm one of theirs.
And I'm just curious, like,
where are you from? Are you from America or from China?
I'm from Beijing, but currently in Jersey City. So
no, clearly, Jersey City is not yet part of Beijing.
Not yet. No, just kidding.
Which part of Beijing did you grow up in?
I grew up in Haidian district, like near Zhongguancun. Like
I know Haidian very well. I was at Beidar before you were born in the 1970s.
No, I was at Minda in the 1980s.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
These are like, Minda is like very close to my childhood.
I know. Did not look like that though. Anyway, we need to let David answer your question.
So my question is, how do this, in your experience, like interacting with like Generation Z, especially like teaching college, how do this like intergenerational wealth reproduction like impact like the mentality of young people? Younger than myself, so I wouldn't really know. But I'm just curious, like, do they feel disillusioned because they get a lot of like Marxist dogma from their classes, or do they feel like that's the way it should be?
It's very interesting. I don't think the Marxist dogma is ever thought of in those terms. So I have to tell you a couple of stories because it's too good to miss. So I ride a bike. I work in SIP, which is about 15 kilometers away from where I live. I live in the old town of Suzhou. And it's great fun. And I often tell people this and they say, isn't it dangerous? Won't you get knocked off? And of course I won't, because Suzhou being Suzhou and SIP being SIP, there are bicycle lanes everywhere. And, you know, it's fairly safe, to be honest. But on campus, it's very dangerous because the rich kids who drive Ferraris come round the corners far too fast as I'm trying to get off campus. So that's where it's very dangerous. Before I came to work here, I was worried. Our fees are very high. So our annual fees are more expensive than the annual income by family of 15% of the population. So we're creaming it, right? We're taking an economic elite, obviously. I was worried, as I think you hinted there, that these might be people who were spoilt to some extent. That has proven to be false. There are 1 or 2 students in every class, every year class, who are a bit too self-entitled. But you know, it's a university. We thrive on self-entitlement, particularly amongst the staff. So seeing 1 or 2 students who have yet to grow up is no real hardship. They do not see what you've just described as Marxist dogma as Marxist dogma. As I think you will probably know if you grew up here, people are very good at compartmentalizing knowledge. So kids have to learn about politics. They have to learn about class. I teach class, or I used to, and I occasionally give lectures on it still. Concept of class. I want the students to engage with my concepts of class from their perspective. Will they? No. Why not? Because, oh no, that was what we learned in our Chinese politics class, Chinese civics class, whatever it's called. It's got nothing to do with what you're talking about. So there's no spillover of knowledge. It's a shame. It's a loss. We could have a real discussion if they would understand that the class they're talking about is actually related to the class I'm talking about, even if it's not identical, or even if the concept of class is worth discussing in itself, which it is. So, but I don't think they see it as Marxist dogma. I don't think they're stupid. There's no notion of not knowing about things, you know, not knowing that there's a row over Xinjiang or Taiwan or whatever. No. People are not ignorant. They're very knowledgeable. They may not express things in class. They may be more reserved. But Marxist dogma, no, they don't see it as Marxist dogma. They see it as what we learnt in that particular class. And on one level, that makes life easier for us, the foreign teachers. We don't have to get involved in the politics of a place that we are aliens in.
On that note, an interesting one to end on. We're just a little bit over time, so if no one has anything urgent, I think we will, those of us who can do it visually, will thank Professor Goodman. It's been a really fascinating conversation. And oh, I see people are using the reaction symbol too.
Well,
can you see that?
Don't applaud. Please just go and buy the book.
Okay. Any final words besides that, David?
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
No, thanks for coming. It's been great. So goodbye, everybody. Thanks for being here. Hope to see you at the next event. Just go to the Rutgers Center for Chinese Studies, and we have quite a roster up for the semester. This international Zoom conferencing is producing all sorts of interesting transnational conversations. David, I was going to ask